Hi class, so this week we're covering chapter 10, data collection and data entry. We're going to focus a lot more on data collection. Data entry, we're going to focus on that next semester. So the objectives for this week is to be able to describe the strengths and limitations of different data collection methods. You should be able to write a plan to recruit research participants. You should be able to write a retention plan in order to limit attrition. Write a data collection protocol that includes a training outline for data collection staff, administer a measurement instrument, and create a database, either in SPSS or Excel, and be able to enter the data. The goals of data collection is basically to have the least possible amount of error, okay? You want to also maximize your response rate. So that means you want to have the least errors possible, and you want to be able to get as much people to answer your survey as you can. Now, the data that you get will depend on several things. It depends on the type of research you're doing, whether you're doing qualitative or quantitative, whether you're doing interviews or online surveys. That will determine how much data you're getting back. Also, the type of research instrument that you're using. So whether you're asking open-ended questions, whether you're doing closed-ended questions. Also, the methods for data collection. So how are you collecting that data? I think I kind of talked about that a little bit, whether you're doing interviews or whether you're doing a survey, whether it's an in-person survey or whether it's online survey. Whenever you do interviews, you have more opportunity to ask for more information versus when it's just a self-reported survey, you get less information than when you have interviews. The relationship with the respondents, that can also provide either more or less data, and the adequacy of your data coding. So whenever you're putting in your data will depend on how you code it. So you need to be able to code your data where it's accurate, right? You're actually being able to go back to that coding and understand what you meant by it. And then accuracy of data input. So making sure that you're putting in that information exactly the way it was on the survey, exactly as it was from the interviews. I don't know how many of you have received surveys in the mail, but those are what we call mail surveys, right? You receive them in the mail and you either fill them out and send them back in, or most people probably just ignore it. I used to get a lot of the mail surveys from like the doctor's office. I think now they just do like either the mail or the phone ones. Sometimes I get the phone calls. So when it comes to mail surveys, here are some things to think about. What is the use and the characteristics of a mail survey? If you're planning on mailing out surveys, you need to make sure that your sample is literate, right? That they're able to read the survey, because you won't be there to help them. You won't be there to read anything for them. So they will need to be able to read that survey on their own. They need to be motivated, because there's no one there to hold them accountable. There's nobody present. If you just mail them a survey, that person has to be really motivated to want to take that survey, to take it, right? If not, they'll probably just throw it in the trash or just ignore it. Cross-sectional, one point in time. So if you're doing a cross-sectional study where you're only needing data one point in time, a mail survey would be a good option, because definitely would be harder to follow up with someone if you just had to mail those surveys. It's going to be harder for you to get follow-up data. It's good also whenever you have large samples and when you don't need to probe or follow up, then it would be a good option. However, if you're needing, to be able to probe them for more answer or follow up for more details, this would not be a good option for that. Mail surveys are relatively inexpensive, so it's very cheap to do. You don't have to worry about interviewer bias, because there's no interviewer present, right? They just get the survey and fill it out on their own. And it also allows for anonymous responses. So the responses can also be anonymous. They can fill it out and mail it back in. It doesn't have to have their address or anything on there. There are some issues though with mail surveys. A lot of it is considered junk mail. I get them all the time. And to be honest, I don't spend much time filling out any mail service that I receive. So you have to consider that as well. Junk mail has made it very difficult for you to get responses because people get so much junk mail. I get so many credit card offers all the time, and I just rip it up and put it in the trash, and they just keep coming. And so, whenever I get mail from someone I don't recognize, I just put it in the trash. I don't even open it, to be honest. So junk mail has definitely made mail in surveys a lot difficult for researchers to get responses back. Response rate is relative low for mail-in surveys, as you can imagine. How many of you, if you get a mail survey, how many of you would probably do it? It would depend, right? It probably has to be something really interesting or something that you're really passionate about, something that you're motivated about to be able for you to even consider to fill it out. Non-response may introduce bias. So you have to think about, you mail out all these surveys and you only get some responses back. So that is what we called non-response bias, right? Because what about the ones that didn't respond, right? Who are they? How different are they from the ones that did respond? So now we don't know how different they were. And then now it's possible that those responses from those that didn't respond would have been completely different. And now we don't have that as part of our sample. Your sample is more likely to be biased when it's heterogeneous. So if your sample is so different, then it's more likely to be biased, especially because the ones that respond will be completely different from the ones that do not respond. And then you don't know who filled it out, right? Because it's a mail-in survey. We don't know who filled it out. So how do you improve those response rates whenever you do the mail-in surveys? Try using close-ended questions. Questions that are simple and they don't have to provide an explanation. It's just, close-ended questions. Pay attention to your formatting and wording. Make sure that your format is very simple, your wording is very simple, that it's easy to read and understand and answer. Keep your questionnaire short to moderate. It just depends on how much data you really need. If you're mailing out that survey, you definitely want to try to keep it as short as possible. No more than 5 pages for sure. If you can get it down to 1, that's great. If not, maybe about 3 would be good. You want to also use an accurate and complete mailing list. So depending on who your population is, try to get an accurate and complete mailing list so you don't miss anyone. Also, incentives would probably be a good thing here, because that can also improve your response rate. So incentives could be anything from gift cards to, I think I've even received money in the mail. It was like $1 or something, but in order to do a survey. It just really depends on the data that you're collecting, the length of the survey, and things like that for you to decide, what would be a good incentive. It also depends on the population as well. Who's in your sample? Who are you getting data from? And that will determine what would be a good incentive to basically reward them for their participation. Also use a cover letter with a letterhead so that they know where the survey is coming from. Use follow-up mailings. More than 2 usually doesn't improve your response rate. So if you send out a survey and you don't get any response, maybe send out another reminder. And if you still don't get any response, maybe try a second time. But mail out reminders maybe once or twice the most. Like anything after 2 times is not going to really make a difference. So if they didn't respond the second time around, just don't waste money mailing out more surveys, because it's highly likely that they just won't do it. So the return rate for your mail-in surveys are about 25 to 35%. That's what's common. You're really wanting a 70%. Okay. So the return rate is basically based on how many surveys you sent out, how many actually responded, right? How many sent them back in. And that's your response rate. So when you calculate the response rate, you don't just use the percent returned. For example, let's say you had 300 mailed, but only 180 responded. So what you would do is you would divide 180 divided by 300, which gives you 60%. So 60% is your actual responses that you got. That's the percentage returned. But you need to subtract those that could not possibly have answered. So people who may have moved or may have died or not, or just hadn't been found. You just couldn't reach them. So basically, what you would do is 300 was mailed out, but 40 was not available. So that equals 260. Okay. And then so your response rate then is not out of 300, it's out of the 260. Okay. So it would be 180 responses divided by 260. So your actual return rate is then 69.2%. So it's closer to the 70%. It's definitely a good response rate versus the 60%. So that's how you calculate your return rate. Okay, so the next one is telephone surveys. So most people have phones, right? However, now most people don't have like a landline phone. Everybody has more like a cell phone. And so you can also use telephone surveys, right? You can do the random digital dialing, which allows you to reach a larger sample, a more representative sample. Usually with this, you get about 20 to 28% refusal rate. So these are people who would either not answer their phone or tell you no over the phone. This also avoids any travel costs. You don't have to go anywhere. You just pick up the phone and call them. It also, you don't have to pay for stamps and paper and all of that. It's easily monitored, so supervisors can really monitor the calls. And it also allows for follow-up in depth. So with the mail-in surveys, you mail it out, you have no control over the responses or getting any follow-up answers. However, over the phone, when they're answering, you can also follow up with more questions or get more details if you needed that. You can also reach people who probably wouldn't open their doors if you actually went to their house. It's more appropriate for youth and for those who don't read and write very well, because you're just asking them questions and the researcher's the one writing it down. So this would be more appropriate for people who don't read or write very well. It allows you to prompt for more clarification or to probe, and also to skip some questions if they've already answered it. So it does help you to be able to maybe lead the research in a different direction, get more clarification, get more details. It also allows for supervision and support of data collection staff. So if you actually have different people collecting the data, it allows for more supervision of those people, because you can be listening in on the phone call, or you can be right there to listen how they're carrying out the research. There are also some disadvantages to cell phone surveys. You can miss nonverbal cues, right? Because you can't see their reaction, and so you can't see any of the nonverbal stuff going on. It will also need to be short, maybe about 20 minutes. People won't want to be on their phones for longer than about 20 minutes at a time. Here, the interviewer is asking the questions and writing down the responses. So it can also have interviewer bias, because the interviewer might interpret the responses in a different way. And so that's how it would be a bias. Not only your participants, but also the interviewers both need to have good verbal skills. This one can also be costly in terms of people's time and telephone charges. So if people don't have unlimited minutes, it can be a cost to them. If the researcher doesn't have unlimited minutes, it can be a cost to them as well. So it can definitely be more time consuming and a little bit more costly in terms of telephone charges. And also telemarketers, right? How many of you always get calls from telemarketers? So telemarketers have definitely ruined the response rates for telephone service as well, because now most people don't answer their phones when they're getting a phone call from someone they don't recognize, right? I'm one of those people. Whenever someone calls and I don't recognize them, I don't answer the phone. There's this thing on iPhones where you can silence unknown callers. And so if you're not in my list of contacts and you're calling me, My phone doesn't even ring. It just sends them straight to voicemail. And so this can also lead to what we call response bias, because we're not getting access to the full sample, right? Because we're only going to get access to the people who do answer their phones. And so the people who either refuse to answer their phones, or when they answer the phone and they realize it's a survey, they say no. Those people can be different than the people who do decide to answer the phones and who do decide to do the actual survey. So now we only have responses from those people. And so that's where the response bias comes in. Then we have in-person surveys. In-person surveys have a higher response rate. These are usually 75 to about 90%, so definitely higher response rates than the other options. Here we can also use visual cues. So as we are asking the questions, we can, see their responses, and we can see if they're bothered, or we can tell whenever, they feel uncomfortable and things like that. You can also probe for more details, or you can also follow up depending on what responses you're getting from them. These type of surveys may last up to an hour. It's a good approach if you're doing exploratory research, because you can get so much more information. So these are actually good for qualitative research as well, because you're going to spend a lot of time with them and you can follow up and get more details. However, these have a higher cost, right? They have other concerns as well. You can be concerned with your personal safety. Sometimes that can be an issue. It can be difficult to have quality control when it comes to the in-person surveys. And the interviewer appearance can also have an effect or bias your result. And then there's a strong social desirability here. So because the interviewer is present, the participants know that they're part of a research study, you have to be worried about social desirability. So this is where they may tell you things that they think you want to hear. So they're going to answer the questions the way they think the researcher wants. Most of you are going to use internet surveys. So these surveys are email surveys or web-based surveys. You can do SurveyMonkey, you can do Google Survey. There's this other thing as well that the university have called Qualtrics, and it's free to use as well. I'm not very familiar with it. I just recently did a training. It seems very simple, but I'm not familiar with it. You guys are welcome to try it out if you want to. But Google is definitely a good, easy one to use as well. If you feel like you can do Qualtrics and it's easy, go ahead. For this class next semester, we're actually going to analyze our data in Excel. So I know both Qualtrics and Google can be pulled out and into Excel, so either one is fine. It's very inexpensive. You can definitely reach a large sample size this way. It's really inexpensive because it's an online survey. This is either emailed. You can email the survey or the survey link, and you can share it on social media. So it's very inexpensive to use. You can definitely reach a larger audience, so a larger sample size using online surveys as well. There are some drawbacks though, just like with any other option that we've discussed. Only computer literate respondents can use it. So you have to think about that. Who is your sample? Who are you trying to reach? So you have to think about who your sample is before sending these out. Make sure that, these people are computer literate. With the online surveys as well, you don't know who's actually filling them out. You don't know if it's the actual participant filling it out or if they're filling it out for somebody else. So you really don't know who's filling it out. There's no visual or verbal cues here, so you can't see them or hear them in this case. But again, it's very inexpensive, so that's always a good thing. You can reach more people. Now, how do you recruit your participants? So part of your data collection, you have to talk about your participants and who they're going to be and how you're going to get them and all of that. So one thing to think about is ethics. You have to fill out what we call an informed consent. And so informed consent basically let participants know that this It's completely voluntary and they don't have to do the survey. They can choose to stop the survey at any time that they feel like. In this informed consent, basically, you would lay out everything about the survey. You would talk about what the research is about, what the purpose of the research is about. You would talk about any benefits, any risk to the participants. You'll talk about how data will be stored and who will have access to that data. You will also talk about incentives as well if you're including an incentive. However, incentives cannot be used to induce participation. So the purpose of incentive is not to basically entice people to do the study. It's basically to offer some type of compensation for their time that they're spending, filling out your survey or participating in your research study. So don't offer $500 to poor women to discuss early sexual abuse trauma. If you're offering $500 to poor people, of course they're going to want to do this survey, right? And so you can't trust that their responses are going to be honest responses. Don't let it be incentive that will make people want to do your survey just because of the money, okay? It needs to be something that's just appropriate based on the time they're spending on the survey. So if you have a 10-minute survey, do you think you should offer $500 to those participants to do that? No, right? So think about your incentives and make sure they're matching your research study. There's also a theory of participation by Caildini. It basically says that people make quick decisions to give, buy, or participate in a research study based on a trigger or a single bit of information. So basically, a trigger is something that leads people to choose one response over another. So people make quick decisions to give, buy, or participate in research based on a single principle or bit of information. So here are some triggers by which people tend to respond to research questions or a research study. The first one is reciprocity. Okay, this is where people repay what has been given to them. So you give me, I give you, right? People are giving back. So small incentives or free gifts increase participation in this case. So basically, people feel like they should repay in some form to another person what is being provided to them. So I do your research study, you give me a small gift, right? Commitment and consistency. So with this one, you want to ask people to make small commitments first, like maybe fill out an interest or an address form. So basically, with this approach, you're creating or building an identity that is consistent with the later request to participate in a research study. So you're asking them to fill out an interest form to participate in the study later on. You want to start with something smaller, easier to achieve before you ask them for a bigger commitment. Basically, with social proof, we determine what's correct by finding out what other people think is correct. So this has to do with group pressure. What others do, okay, everybody's filling it out, then I'll fill it out too. Everybody's participating in this research study, maybe I should do it too. Okay, so don't ask for participation in a group if you think that the first ones asked will not volunteer. So we comply when we like someone. So if we like someone, we're going to, do what they're asking us to say. For example, you like your professor, and so your professor is asking you to go to an event or attend this conference or fill out the survey. You're probably going to do it, right? More likely to do it for a professor that you like versus a professor you don't like. We comply when we believe we are similar to someone. So we also are more likely to participate if we feel like we're similar to, someone else, or we may also comply when we believe that the project is related to something good or worthwhile. So if we feel like it's for a good cause, then we're going to do it. So we also comply with those in authority. So if someone in authority is asking you to do something, it's more likely that you're going to participate. Again, like if your professor asks you to participate in a research survey, you're probably going to do it. You probably feel compelled to do it. So think about that in research as well. We have to be careful when asking people to do things like filling out a survey if we're in authority. students can feel pressured. They can feel like, well, if I don't do it, I'm going to get a bad grade. They're going to fail me. And so we have to be very careful when doing research like that. And we have to make sure that our students understand through the informed consent that, this is completely voluntary, and whether you choose to participate or not, it will not affect your grade in any way possible. And we have to be very careful that our students really understand that and not participate in a research study just because they feel like they have to, and if they don't, that they're gonna fail or anything like that. So think about that when it comes to authority. Those are some things to consider. You don't want your participants to feel like they have to do something because of who the researcher is. If something is not readily available, we want that. So we want to be a part of something that's not very common. You want to advertise limited space and deadline for enrollment. So like, you want to make sure that participants know that we only have limited spacing available, and here's the deadline by which you have to enroll if you want to participate. So people are more likely to, get involved or be more likely to enroll when they know that, oh, this is going to fill up very quickly, or there's a deadline, I have to do it by such a date. Okay, so another thing to consider in data collection is your system framework. So here you want to talk about your participants. Who's the participants? Who's your sample? Talk about their demographics. Talk about any variables of interest. You have to understand who your target system is. What is the connection to any other systems? Who's the gatekeepers? Who are people that can provide you access to the sample? Think about things like subculture, what is their values, their lifestyle. All of these things will help you in terms of how to reach those participants and how to get them. In your data collection portion of your paper, you are going to have to define who those participants are and how you're going to reach them. You want to tailor recruitment to fit the life circumstances of the target population. So make sure that it's appropriate language for the people you're trying to reach. If you have to translate, make sure that's readily available. Provide easy access. So think about time and place and transportation. If it's not an online survey, if it's an in-person survey, think about where you're going to have it. Also think about transportation. If, depending on your sample, are they going to be able to have transportation to the location? You also want to match characteristics of the recruiter to your population. So you want to make sure that, you have similar recruiters. Your recruiters need to be very similar to your participants. Also be ready to provide resources like childcare, for example. A lot of times people may choose not to participate in a research study because they don't have childcare. And if that's an issue, you may have to be ready to provide those resources for your participants. Another big thing is planning for retention. This is making sure you try to keep as much people in your study as possible. You will have attrition, so people will drop out of your study over time. However, you can plan ahead for this. That way you have enough people, so it doesn't really matter if people drop out of or not, because people will drop out. So retention is basically the ability to retain individuals over time. So it's basically your ability to be able to keep people in your survey. Attrition is the loss of those study participants over time. So different things may happen. People may move, or they may lose interest in the survey, or, things happen. People die. These are just different reasons as to why you may lose people in your study. This is a bigger concern when you're doing a study that's going to take a very long time. If you're doing a cross-sectional where it's just one point in time, it's not that big of a concern. It's more a big concern for an online survey, a one point in time survey, whenever your survey is very long. So here are some strategies. You want to make sure you develop rapport with your participants. You want to develop a good tracking system or database. So you basically want to have other contact information to reach people. So not just their own phone number, but maybe a relative's phone number. You also want to minimize your research burden. So time, the task, expenses, childcare, number of requests. So try to keep those as low as possible. You want to make sure that, the time spent on the survey is going to be as short as possible, depending on the type of survey you're doing, 15, 20 minutes. The task amount of things they may have to do. It needs to be inexpensive as possible. Provide childcare if that's something that's needed. Also, provide incentives. That definitely helps. It needs to be small. Again, it needs to be something that compensates them for their time. It doesn't need to be anything that's going to make them do the survey just for the incentives. All right, so the data collection protocol. So these are written instructions on how your data is going to be collected. So this is going to be step-by-step approach as to how you're going to collect your data. This needs to be very clear. It needs to provide enough details that anybody can pick it up and read it and know exactly how data was collected and be able to do it themselves. So here you're going to talk about your schedule of measures. So what is collected? When was it collected? Talk about your tracking procedures. What data to collect? Talk about your equipment needed if you are using any equipment, where and when. You can also include answers to frequently asked questions. Provide any incentive policy, who gets what and when they get this. So for example, if you're providing an incentive, you need to specify who gets this incentives and how or when they get it. For example, let's say you're offering a $25 gift card drawing. You need to be very specific that this is a drawing, and you need to be very specific that it's $25. You need to be very specific of what type of gift card it is, whether it's a Visa gift card, Amazon gift card, whatever it is. And you also need to specify whether participants have to complete the study in order to participate. So generally, to get participants to complete the entire survey, you want to make sure that the only way they can get the incentive or be a part of the drawing is that they have to complete the entire survey. Okay, so you need to be very specific about that. You need to talk about safety protocols, any emergency numbers that needs to be included. Make sure that those are included. For example, let's say you're doing a sensitive topic that can traumatize someone or can cause some people to be uncomfortable or have some discomforts. You may need to include, some type of number that they can call, for example, like a hotline, an emergency hotline for any type of trauma or things like that. Make sure you include that in there. Standardization in administration. So making sure that if you have different people carrying out this survey or carrying out this research study, that it's standardized so everybody's doing the same things. So make sure that they had some type of training that everybody's doing it in the same exact format. Also, supervision. How, by whom? If you have someone supervising the research study, who's going to do it and how they're going to do it. And also written examples of what to do and what not to do in terms of your research. So these are things that needs to be very clear for everyone who's carrying out the research study and who's going to be collecting data. So when it comes to your actual research paper, because this is like your data collection protocol in terms of what needs to be done, who's going to do it, and things like that. Whenever you're writing up your research paper, you have to include all of this if it applies to your research study. In terms of questions, answers to frequently asked questions, I don't think any of you will have that. You can have that, but it's not going to go in your actual paper itself. Okay, so your paper itself will probably talk about so what data is to be collected, how it's going to be collected, who's going to collect it, when it's going to be collected. You're going to talk about when and where it's going to be collected. You're going to talk about whether you have incentive and what the incentive is going to be and who gets it, when and how, and things like that, how much of an incentive it is. So describe that as well. You're also going to talk about, who's going to do what, when, and how. Other things about your protocol, and this is mostly for, like I said, the actual data collection protocol. This is for like the researchers to have. It's not going to be something that's included in your research paper itself. So work habits. What do you expect the staff to have? Record keeping, what's going to be kept and who's going to be keeping this. Securing your data. So how are you going to secure your data, by whom and by when. Recording your data as well. How you're going to record your data, who's going to record it, when are they going to record it. the timeline, when will data collection and analysis be done, talk about rules for research staff, and how a third party can review your evidence. So talk about any other thing that you're going to have in journaling. So these are all part of your protocol again. As far as your paper, you're probably, yes, need to include, if you're having record keeping, what that's going to be and who's going to do that. You also need to include in your actual paper how you're going to secure data, right? How you're going to do it, who's going to do it, and by when. Same thing as recording the data. So if you're doing any kind of recording, that also needs to go in your paper as well. Your timeline will also need to be discussed in your paper as well. Here's an important concept: Mack Truck theory of life. So very important as you're working on your research project. Keep backup. Back up your data, people. On any given day, anyone can get hit by a Mack truck. Hopefully not. You get the point, right? Nobody's gonna get hit by a truck, okay? However, it's just trying to tell you that anything can happen. And so you want to make sure that everything is written down somewhere and that you have backup information. This is a group project. Anything can happen to a member of the group. Someone can get sick, or someone, let's say someone dropped the class, or whatever the reason is, okay? If you can't reach that person and that one person has all the data, what's going to happen to the rest of the class or the rest of the people in the group, right? So please back up your data. Everyone in the group needs to have a copy of it. All right, so here's an example of the Excel database. So this is what your data is going to look like. You should be able to export your data. If you use Qualtrics, you should be able to export it in Excel. If you use Google Survey, you should still be able to do that. I'm not sure how they did it, but my students did it in the past. They said it's very easy to do. So we'll have to figure that part out. But if you cannot do it, then you have to manually just type in everything in there. But basically, so for this data set, here's the names. You guys won't have names, but in this case, we have names here. Here's the age. So age was a variable, race was a variable. And if you see for race, it has letters, right? So W for white, B for black, H for Hispanic, and A for Asian. So basically, this is the data just the way it was entered, right? Campus, the same way. We have the McKinney campus, the Commerce campus, and the Mesquite campus. And then everything else is numbers. The survey questions here that they responded to, they responded from 1 to 5, which was strongly disagree to strongly agree. So when you have your data like this, and this is where we talk about, this is the data entry part. So you either will be able to have this already in there for you and export it from either Google Survey or Qualtrics into Excel, or you'll have to basically manually put this into Excel. And we're going to talk about this next semester, where you get to change the W's and the B's and A's and H's into numbers. So that's what we call coding. So for example, we would say W equals 1, B equals 2, A equals 3, and H equals 4. Okay, so we gave them numbers because when you're trying to run your statistics, we can't run it with letters. It's not going to do anything. So we have to assign these letters numbers. Okay, and we're going to cover more of that next semester. I just wanted you guys to see what your data set is going to look like. This is what we call a database. So this is your Excel database. All right, so that's it for chapter 10, data collection and data entry. We will talk about this some more during our live chat. If you guys have any questions, we can talk about that during the live chat as well.